Good morning, good evening, good night, good afternoon. We have folks from all over the globe. Welcome everyone to the Improvement Professionals Evolving Role. This is a webinar that's pretty special to me because I've been doing some pretty deep studying over the past couple of years on how to better develop improvement professionals, and there's some really exciting new things on the horizon, some things that have been coming to us for about the past 2 years that I'd like to share with you in the hopes that we'll be able to together help develop your skills and at least help you identify some of the skill sets that you might want to develop with. So let's take a look at who we've got on the phone. This was a pretty popular webinar. I'm happy to say that 36 states in the United States has at least one person on the phone. And we also have global friends in Australia where it's 4 a.m., Canada, Great Britain, Puerto Rico, Qatar, where it'll be after midnight when this webinar is done, Spain and Switzerland. So welcome everyone. If you're unfamiliar with GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar technology, there are two ways that you can listen in. You can either use speakers on your computer or telephone. If you're using speakers, just please know that you're muted. Telephone as well, everyone is muted. And then if you're using a telephone, you'll want to put the audio pin in by pressing the pound sign and then whatever that pin number is that's showing on your control panel and the pound sign. There are two ways to ask questions. You can either raise your hand throughout the session if you'd like to ask a question verbally, or you can type your question into the question log down below on your control panel. I am going to hold most of the questions until the end of the webinar, but if there's something that pops up that's very urgent, and relevant to what I'm talking about right then and there that seems like we should stop everything and take questions, I'll go ahead and do that. But otherwise, we'll wait until the very end, probably about the last 30 minutes of the webinar. And then for those of you who don't know me, I'm not sure I even said my name. I'm Karen Martin. Welcome, everyone. My early years were as a scientist, and then I migrated to operations design and management in the mid-'80s, and then became quite a Deming devotee and learned a lot about Deming's principles. So it was an easy transition to Lean when Lean hit U.S. soil. I launched my consulting firm in 1993 in Santa Monica, California, and now I'm living in San Diego. And what I do is I provide support to every industry in the area, though, specifically about office service and knowledge work. So if I work with manufacturing, it's off the shop floor, and then a wide variety of other industries. If you're curious about my client list, you can check that out on my website. I'm the co-author with Mike Osterling of the Kaizen Event Planner. It's a book that we put together because we felt Kaizen events were a bit unique in the office and knowledge work environment. And then we co-developed a mapping tool called metrics-based process mapping, and we have an Excel tool for archiving the maps. And then I just placed a book with McGraw-Hill that will be out in May of 2012 that is a unique look at excellence and what organizations can do to be more successful with their improvement approaches no matter what they're using. And then lastly, I do teach at the University of California, San Diego's Lean Enterprise program. Unfortunately, for those of you that live a distance away, it's a program that meets once a month, so it's difficult for people to fly in. It's really much more geared to local folks here in Southern California. So I decided I wanted to see a little bit about the breadth of knowledge and experience on today's webinar. And I asked the question, some of you who downloaded the materials a little bit earlier today will notice that these things don't add up to 100. I've corrected that. It took raw numbers instead of percentages on the initial draft. But this gives you an idea of the range of folks that are on the phone. This does make planning webinars a bit tricky when you've got such a broad range of skill sets, but I hope I've done a decent job at being able to provide basic information for some of you and then advanced information for others of you. If you're curious to know the difference between coaching expertise and facilitation expertise, I asked this question specifically to see how closely aligned people were on coaching and facilitation. You'll see, again, a pretty even spread of proficiency. So this is a fun group to have, and I'm hoping the Q&A will be pretty diverse and interesting questions at the end because of this diversity. And then something I added in after I loaded the slides on the link that you had is the industries that are represented. You'll see a very broad range. In fact, I'm not sure what's missing here. Maybe law enforcement, Not a whole lot missing from this list, so I love seeing this interest in improvement and in becoming more effective improvement professionals across all these different industries. Very, very good news. I'd like to do one thing before we go into the bulk of the webinar. Could we do a quick sound check? And for those of you who are familiar with that hand raising that we do on the webinars, could you please raise your hand and let me know that you can hear me loud and clear? Okay, excellent. All right. It's just always a little weird. I feel like the wizard behind the screen here and want to make sure everyone can hear. So let me take everyone's hand back down. Okay, good. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so what are we going to learn? We're going to learn how doing for others, as much as we think that's the right thing to do and we want to be helpful, actually violates the number 1 or 2 core principles with Toyota's 2 pillars that they have: respect for people and continuous improvement. So it's in pretty grave violation of one of those principles, respect for people, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The differences between facilitating and coaching, I view them as quite different. You know, reasonable minds may differ, so we'll see what you think about that. The traits and skills that you need to be an effective coach, because I think coaching is somewhat new to the improvement world. While it's been around the executive world for quite a while, it's somewhat new to improvement professionals. And then how to roll out a development program across your organization. We're not going to get into a lot of detail on this last one because it's so unique. Every organization, every culture is so unique. It's tough to just give a broad brush, you know, cookie cutter approach for everyone because it really can't be done with a cookie cutter. But I will give you some tips and things to think about. Okay, so let's talk about what I consider to be the improvement continuum. Where are we in our current state? We've been at this for decades and decades in the United States. Where are we? Well, in the lean world in specific, we've come a long way, baby. From 1996, when Jim Womack wrote the book Lean Thinking, which most of us consider to be kind of the Bible of the lean enterprise world. If you look at the index of this book, it's interesting that neither the word culture nor leadership occurs in the index. And that's not a failing of Womack and his perspective. That's where we were at. As we were starting to peel back the layers of the Toyota onion and starting to understand what makes them tick and makes them so successful, the first glance that we had was from our very Western minds. And of course we would do it that way. We would look at it that way. And our Western minds didn't see some of the more subtle, nuanced Eastern thinking that really is the core of the Toyota way. And for those of you who are brand new to Lean, I think most people understand that Lean comes from and has evolved from the Toyota production system. So then in 2004, when Jeff Leiker wrote The Toyota Way, we got a little more deep into the key principles, and a lot of the people elements of how Toyota operates came out in The Toyota Way. So we started getting more and more into how do they do it from a people perspective and from a cultural perspective. And then fast forward 4 years later, when the 2 A3 books that came out, there are many more, but the 2 big ones that came out on the same year, that was the first time that we got introduced to coaching and mentoring and the need for leadership to become much more active in driving improvement rather than improvement professionals doing it. So that was kind of a pivotal time in our understanding of Lean and Toyota production system. And then the Toyota Kata book that Mike Rother produced and released in last year in 2010 introduced us to a much more one-on-one version of problem solving with the front lines. So the A3 process very often doesn't engage all the way down to the front lines. It can and it should, but it doesn't sometimes. Whereas Toyota Kata is absolutely down there on the front lines and helping the worker themselves learn how to problem solve and put in the most effective solutions with very clear guidance and direction. So let's put this out there right now that we're not talking about self-directed work teams here. The workforce is very engaged, but they're not just out there by themselves floundering. It's a very methodical way, a methodical way, and a very directed way toward making improvement. And then this year, Jeff Liker released the Toyota Way to Continuous Improvement, his book that focuses solely on how do they do this? How do they do this at a deep level? What's leadership's role? What are the front lines doing? Do they have improvement professionals that are dedicated to continuous improvement, or don't they? You know, all those questions that we've been talking about for years got answered in that book. I just finished it about maybe a month ago, and I highly recommend you read this book. Actually, I recommend you read all these books, because if you're going to get serious into the world of improvement, you really have to know the history. I'm going to take a quick break here and answer one question I see coming in. The link to the materials were, if you have your reminder email from either yesterday or this morning, the links for both the handout that has 2 slides per page and the full slides per page was on that email. So if you can just find that email, that link is on there. Okay, moving forward. So let's talk about this one of 2 pillars of Toyota Production System, respect for people. What respect for people means is, first of all, that they're able to do their work successfully, that they're able to feel good about what they're doing, they're producing good quality, and that means that we're relentlessly looking at obstacles to that success and doing whatever it takes to remove those obstacles. So one of the things I like to talk about is, if you have processes that aren't working well, we often just go quick to blaming the people, and it is, my experience is hardly ever anything about the people. It's all systems related, it's process design related, and so we really have to become far more relentless in removing those obstacles that are not allowing people to be successful. When we do that, they're going to get far more engaged in their work, and all kinds of wonderful business performance outcomes come from that. Then the second thing is that respecting people means helping them grow. So it's helping them achieve their intellectual and their creative potential, or what they already bring to the table that they're not adequately using. So I talked with someone yesterday as they were coming home from work, and asked, he's been in this company for 4 years, and was asking him a little bit about his job, and he said, it's stable, they pay well, I'm okay as far as my intellectual stimulation, but creatively, I'm dead. There is nothing that I'm contributing on a creative level, and so he's starting a side business just to get that creative potential and that creative energy that he's got used in some way. And I think we have a wonderful opportunity to make our workplaces have them provide that for people, so you don't have to go looking elsewhere for it necessarily, but have it be part of everyone's everyday job. I mean, of course, there's always going to be the mundane part of a job, but to the degree that we can help people be creative, we will have done a great service for a great many people. So if respecting people is removing obstacles and helping them grow so that they can achieve their potential, the only way to do that and be successful with improvement is to fully engage them in the problem-solving process. So when you look at resistance to change and people not wanting to play, many of your questions when you registered were around, how do I get people to play well together? How do I get people to, accept change? How do I get people to not dig their heels in? There was a lot of that theme, and I deal with it every day as well, and so it is a problem. But to the degree that we engage people in solving problems, they're not going to resist their own ideas typically. And so when you get them actively engaged, then your whole issue about resistance starts melting away. It doesn't go away completely, never does, but you greatly reduce it by engaging employees in the first place. Now, what do we mean by engaging? Well, engaging is not doing. Engaging is involving, guiding, perhaps teaching, but it's not doing for people. And this is something I know very well personally, because I'm a classic type A, and most of you probably are as well. I think people that are drawn to improvement typically are pretty high energy and actually pretty smart people, and we're able to see things quickly, and the more seasoned you are, the quicker you're able to see some of the areas that could be improved and what the possible countermeasures that will be effective are. The faster you start moving and are able to see it, the harder it is to not do for people. So I'm going to let's digress for a moment. Many of you are parents, some of you are probably not, but let's think about what parenting is like versus what the workplace is like. When you're parenting a child, you can either do for them or you can teach them to do it for themselves. So teaching them to fish, basically, instead of fishing for them. It takes, does it not, incredibly more patience than patience. It takes a fair amount more time to have them learn how to do it on their own than it is to do for them. So now let's go back into the workplace. Same thing. It takes a lot more time and a lot more patience to help people learn how to do things on their own than it is to do for them. In today's business world, and actually it's existed for decades, the problem is that we get very, very impatient and chop, 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 fires are fighting, fires are raging, we've got to fix this. And there's this rush to fix, and the rush to fix disengages the employees. There's no way to engage someone and rush through it because they're learning. Learning takes time. And so we have to just constantly be sensitive to our needs to develop people as well as getting results. So, if you look over all the different types of improvement you're doing in an organization, all the problems you're solving, the bulk of them should be being solved the slower, needing more patience kind of way, with a very small percentage of them where people are just going in and doing it because it's that urgent. I mean, there are things that are that urgent in business, and so I don't want to suggest that you don't ever go in and just do, but it should be a very small percentage of the total amount of problem solving that's occurring. Hopefully that makes some sense. So now that we are looking at how do we engage people, there's this parallel path that's happening at the same time. We're learning that we haven't engaged people enough. We also are learning that we cannot have a bunch of tools that we're looking for problems. Out there, I've got 5S, I'm going to go 5S. I've got Kanban, let me find some inventory. We really started down this lean path because we finally had a set of very practical tools. They were fun to learn. They were in some cases easy to learn, in some cases not so easy. And so once you have a new skill, the temptation is to go and you want to apply it, right? So you go and look for a problem. We are moving very rapidly into the opposite, where instead of having tools in search of problems, we are now looking for problems that are in need of tools. You see that? Very different thinking, very different emphasis. So it starts with, what problem are we trying to solve? What's the problem? Then let's figure out, and only then do we figure out what tools we need to solve that problem. Very different thinking than the path that we've been on. Also, we're moving much more toward what I call, I don't think anyone else is calling it this, I'm calling it problem-based management. Problem-based management is moving away from this thing where leaders don't want to hear about problems. The problems are bad. People get punished if there's a problem that they bring up to the surface. So we're moving away from the problems are hidden and bad to a point where problems are golden. They're like little golden nuggets that you can mine, and even the word problem is kind of an interesting discussion. The word problem back in I think it was about mid-'80s, started turning, or maybe it was early 90s, started turning into this opportunities for improvement, or OFIs. And to me, that was an attempt to soften what's really going on with a problem. Also, what do you think about the sense of urgency around the word problem versus an opportunity? Opportunities can be bypassed. I mean, we bypass opportunities all the time, but problems are pretty tough to ignore. So by changing the language, I think we actually reduce the sense of urgency that exists with true problems. So I would encourage you in your organizations to start using the P word. Use it all the time. Get people comfortable with it. It's not an easy transition in organizations that haven't had a problem-focused vocabulary and behavior. So take it a step at a time, but start embracing the P word. Problems, problems, problems. It really will help us with a sense of urgency. We also very much need to move, given those two needs, moving to a problem-based environment, needing to involve people, we need to move from relying on a small team of experts to solve our problems to teaching everyone how to solve problems. So this is something when, back in the day when the learning organization, that phrase became known, I don't think anyone, or not many people really grasped what the learning organization was. But what it really is it's learning how to solve problems, learning the technical information that you need to solve problems, learning how to work culturally within an organization to solve problems. It's really becoming much more proficient in solving problems across the whole organization. So how do we do this? Well, there were two brothers, Stuart and Hubert Dreyfus, in 1980 at Berkeley that came up with this model of skill acquisition that is having a bit of a resurgence today, in large part because Mike Rother talks a lot about it in his Toyota Kata workshops and in his book Toyota Kata, which I highly recommend you read, and I highly recommend you attend one of his workshops if you can. And they decided that if you look at the brain and how the brain evolves, that you start out in a novice role and then move through to advanced beginner, then you become competent, then you become proficient, and then you become expert. And until I learned about this when I was in my graduate program in adult education, but I had kind of forgotten about it until Mike brought it up again. And I remembered that until I had heard about it, I had thought competent and proficient were pretty much synonymous and were synonyms for one another. And then I learned that no. There's actually a different amount of skill acquisition between those two that take you up to expert status. So if you look at the continuum, you start from, as a novice, needing to have very strict rules. So when you're teaching for example, A3 reports, for those of you that are familiar with A3 problem solving, the report format is probably helpful to start with so that people have rules. And the two-column report format is probably the best one to start with, in my opinion, when people are just learning. P of the PDCA cycles on the left, DCA is on the right. Very strict, people can learn the process. But then, as you move up the ladder, you're moving to this expert status where you know when to break the rules. So you'll know when the problem-solving process that you're trying to document, and you're only documenting it so that you can teach it across the organization, you might need to move to more of a tic-tac-toe model where you have 9 quadrants. Or your P stage might need to go onto the right side, and that's okay. Knowing how to reflect the problem-solving process, you get more and more experience with it as you're practicing. So practice is the key here in problem solving over and over and over. Also, a couple of you when you registered asked about how to get more confidence in your problem solving or improvement roles. Again, practice, 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 because as you move up this ladder, you move from very low degrees of confidence to very high degrees of confidence. As you're becoming more and more expert in performing any task, you're going to get much more confident in doing it. So again, practice, practice, practice. And then finally, in the novice world, you're having to concentrate a great deal on whatever it is you're doing. So remember back to any of those of you who play musical instruments. Remember back to when you were first learning that instrument and how darn hard it was and how much focus and energy it took, versus once you became a little more proficient, you're able to basically play a song and not necessarily think about every single note and every single beat. So you get more on autopilot as you go on. So as you're starting to both develop yourselves and go out there and develop your workforce, keep thinking about this continuum. And by the way, the continuum doesn't always go forward. You can actually move up and then take a bit of a dip back a little bit as new information is revealed or as you experience new situations, new conditions, and then you learn more about that condition, and then you get back up to the stage that you were at. So competent could slip back to advanced beginner, and then you move back to competent. But more or less, you're moving in a forward fashion. Now, another way to look at this is just the simple learn, do, teach. So most of you are probably familiar with the way that people learn the best is by doing. The way they learn the absolute best is by teaching others how to do it. So this is a bit of the continuum in a more simple fashion. So how do we do this? Well, I'm playing around right now with a very extensive Excel self-assessment, well actually it's going to be a PDF eventually, a self-assessment tool for improvement professionals on where they're at and where they need to develop. So I'm sharing with you an early draft of it, and any of you that have any ideas that you think should be added to it, I'd love to hear them. And then what I'll do is if you don't get my newsletter already, you should sign up for that, because by this August newsletter, which is going out next week or next month, I'll have the final done, and then there'll be a link to where you can get it, and I'll also put it on my Facebook site so that you have a link to get this full self-assessment. But basically, I've broken it into 4 areas. So the first area is, what are the philosophical elements that you need to be familiar with as an improvement professional? And you can score yourself from I have no knowledge about that all the way up to your expert status. Or to make this flexible, I also have a not applicable column for people that are, for example, in the practitioner mode and not moving into coaching mode. They won't need to know everything that's on this list, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But the list is an extensive list of all the things if you want to be highly, highly expert in being an improvement professional, all the things so far that I think are needed. So philosophical, we've got those different categories. And then on the technical side of things, this is where all your tools would be, root cause analysis tools as well as countermeasures. A quick note about the word countermeasure. We are also moving away from using the term solution, because solution carries with it a sense of permanence. So solutions, just by using that word, you'll get people thinking, okay, we fixed that problem, boom, done, let's move on to the next one, instead of instilling continuous improvement in the organization. So countermeasure, even though it sounds like, you know, kind of a military term, it's the correct term to use, because it's only a countermeasure for a period of time. The minute conditions change, you may have a new problem on your hands and you have to come up with another countermeasure. So it really instills that sense of continuous improvement. The other thing down here, you'll see software. I have found a number of fairly skilled improvement professionals that really aren't very proficient with Excel, for example. And you know, once you're starting to do data analysis, it's pretty tough to be effective without having a pretty good command of Excel. I don't know that you need to go all the way to becoming proficient with pivot tables and all of that, although that's nice if you can, but to be able to use Excel in a basic to moderate way is important. And then the other thing is there's this whole idea about time management and project management, a bit different from improvement per se, but you have to be pretty skilled in those as well in order to be effective. People skills. Well, the list could have been 5 slides long on this one, so I actually ended up going into higher level categories, and I may or may not break them down further, so I'd love your input on that as well. But basically, I'm thinking that you have to have a fairly good sense of basic psychology. So if you haven't taken a Psych 101 class, there's plenty of opportunity online. There are, you know, community colleges have inexpensive ways to take a psych class if you want the in-person experience. You really need to get some basic psychology under your belt if you're going to do any level of improvement whatsoever, or influencing, even influencing people. And then just skipping down, the other thing that I think is important is keeping up with learning theory. There's a whole lot going on right now in the area of neuroscience and the neuroplasticity of the brain. And there's a lot going on out there, a lot of good books that are pretty easy to read on the brain out there on the market right now. And then we'll talk about Socratic questions today, but I do think that it's important also to become fairly experienced in working with senior leadership. So some of you, I know quite a few of you that are on the webinar today, and some of you are quite senior already and quite proficient with this. Some of you have admitted that you're very uncomfortable talking with vice presidents and what I call the C-suites, you know, chief operating officers, chief executive officers. And if you want to elevate yourself, you've got to get comfortable in that environment, and you've got to speak their language and learn how to speak their language. So that's something you could put on your own personal development plan to get better at that and feel more comfortable. And I would just encourage you to get an audience with senior leadership as often as you can. That's the only way to build skills, is practice, practice, practice. So on the business side, here's something that a lot of improvement professionals don't have and don't don't really think about is it's important if you're going to be looking at expense reduction, for example, it's important that you understand what the various categories are and what percentage of an organization that you work for, what their expenses are. What are their highest expenses? Is it people? Is it material? You know, what are some of the areas where you're outsourcing and you could perhaps insource if there's capability that you could build in the organization to cut that expense? You know, where are the categories? Those kinds of things are important. Revenue sources. Where do you get your money as an organization? It's critical that you know that. It's critical you know what percent it's coming in from various sources. You really need to understand the flow of money in an organization to be effective in operations if you want to get beyond this very tactical, in the weeds kind of improvement role. And then the list goes on. The one thing I'd say down here with these two, or actually these three, the improvement approaches, certification programs, and staying current, it's not critical that you become proficient in all of these. It's critical you know what they are so that you can speak the language and understand when people refer to something what they're talking about. So I think that the best way to do this is to read, go to conferences, network with people. LinkedIn's got all kinds of great groups. You can ask questions. You can respond to questions. If you're not staying current, you're probably going to get left behind pretty quickly. So another thing that I think is important is taking that list and then looking at, okay, where do I go from here? Rome wasn't built in a day, but how do I move from one stage to the next? And you're probably going to need some sort of expert help. The good news is there's a lot of online help you can do. There's in-person help you can do. You can have your own coach if you want to. But the main thing is you've got to get out there and practice. So sitting in a classroom and learning how to create standard work, theoretically, is one thing. Getting out there and leading a team in creating standard work is a whole different ball of wax. So you have to get out there and start practicing all the different skills. If you don't get practice, you will lose anything you learned in a classroom. So here's just some ideas I'm throwing out. You know, I'm a believer in pretty simple tracking. I think we spend too much time some of the times tracking things. But let's say you've got a team of people that you want to see get developed on that the 4 different areas that I just showed you with the Excel things. You could put together a very simple matrix where you list the people down your left column and then you list across the top whatever it is, the categories you want people to learn. And then you could classify people as being either highly proficient and they can teach others, or they're competent and they can do things on their own with little or no help, or they have absolutely no experience. And this becomes a great visual of where development needs to happen. So if you have a centralized improvement department and a process comes up that needs to be looked at because of some sort of problem that's revealed, you know, you could pair someone up who's an expert with someone who needs the experience so that you can move them from red to yellow and from yellow to green. I think that whole pairing is a very, very important element in development. The other thing is that you could take the 3 colors, you could make multiple colors for that matter, but you could also move to the Dreyfus categories. And I noticed that someone just asked a question about what are examples of each of those elements. I would just Google Dreyfus. There is a ton of information on what makes a novice, what makes a competent person competent, how do you define that. So just go ahead and Google. There's just so much information out there on it. Unfortunately, I just can't cover everything in a webinar. And then the other thing that you could do is you can, instead of rating people on how knowledgeable they are and what their skill proficiency is, you could color code this based on the role they play in the organization. So red might be that the person is a great practitioner, they're fully competent and proficient in a tool, but maybe they're not able to facilitate yet. They haven't had that kind of practice facilitating a whole team in making improvement. Or it might be that they are in coach status. So I think of coaches as being kind of the top dog, and I don't mean top dog in terms of rank. I mean they already embody fully developed facilitator and practitioner skills, and a facilitator has fully developed practitioner skills. Now, this isn't, how do I say this? These categories overlap, so you can be highly proficient in, say, 5 of the tools that are countermeasures and be very effective in facilitating that, but you haven't ever had exposure to some of the other tools. So you can be at different stages. Only you really can know where you're at on each of these things. So that's just an idea that you could work toward if you have a team of people in an organization. Who's ready to facilitate? Who's ready to coach? So let's talk about the differences. Well, here's my stab at it. I see a practitioner as someone who just does it. That's their primary focus. They do it. So if, for example, someone says to you, hey, put together a value stream map of this value stream, and you go out and you interview people and you draw a current state map yourself, and you're doing it pretty much by yourself in pieces, then that's being a practitioner. A facilitator is leading others in doing it. So facilitating value stream mapping would be you working with a team of up to 10 people, and collectively they're creating the map. You're leading it and you're responsible for results, but they're the ones that are doing the technical work, the mechanics of creating the map and all of that. You know, and you're playing, I'll go into the facilitator role in just a minute. So you're playing a facilitator role to ease their ability to deliver results. A coach is teaching others how to do it. So when you're in a facilitator role, you are also coaching, but that's not your full focus. So the way to think about it is a facilitator's primary responsibility is getting results. And secondarily, you're developing people. So in a value stream mapping activity, ideally, you're helping them learn how to create value stream maps so that you can spread the knowledge. Kaizen event, you're teaching people how to do PDCA. You're teaching them how to think through problems and move it on. But it's a team of people and you're leading them. A coach is typically 1, 2, 5 maybe at the most people that you're coaching, and your primary objective as a coach is developing the person. Results are secondary. And this is where organizations have to change their thinking. You can't have people coaching and demanding results be number one. Coaching is about people development. So you're going to get much more results much more quickly in the future by developing the people. And that's a tough one for very Western thinking leaders to get. So that's my view of the difference between these. And again, there is some overlap. So the facilitator, when you're in front of a team and you're facilitating Kaizen events or value stream maps or whatever, you're playing more roles than you do as a coach. So in other words, a facilitator is a very, very big time management person. So in value stream mapping or Kaizen events or any kind of project, you're watching the time and making sure that they're delivering results within that context of time. You're also perhaps mediating. So you might have disagreements between some parties and you're actually serving as the mediator in that case. And as a coach, you would not be mediating. The people you're coaching would be mediating, and you'd be teaching them how to mediate. So hopefully that helps a little bit between the facilitator and the coach. The other thing is that there's a lot more directing going on in the facilitator role and less of that in the coach. Not that it's not there, but it's less directing and more guiding. And hopefully you can see the subtle nuances between directing and guiding. So directing is a little more telling, and guiding is getting people to come to the decisions themselves and implement themselves. In a Kaizen event, you should be, and I do a fair amount of guiding and getting the team to come up with their own decisions. But there's a time element, and so if they're not coming up with it quickly, then you do have to slip into a little bit more of a direction role, making sure that you're not taking away their ability to disagree. That has to still be there, and you have to make sure that the ideas that they implement, they do agree with, and you have consensus, but there's just a little more directing that can go on in a Kaizen event than what you would be if you're being purely a coach. So now let's talk about coaching. What exactly is coaching? There are two different things that get confused pretty easily, and I have found it very helpful to separate them out. When you're being a pure coach, by the pure sense of the word, the coach is typically drawing wisdom from whoever they're coaching, the coachee. So the wisdom resides in the coachee's head. The coach is drawing it out. How do they do that? By asking questions. So they're asking questions, drawing it out, asking questions, drawing it out. While they're doing that, they're assessing. How is the coachee doing? Is the coachee making progress? Is the coachee stuck? Does the coachee need help? You're assessing, so you're asking questions, asking questions. Then what happens is, let's say that you discover that, yes, they do need help. They don't understand something. They're missing a skill that they need, whatever. Then you move into what's called a mentoring relationship, where you're now relaying, as the coach or the previous coach, as a mentor, you're relaying your wisdom to the mentee or the person that you're working with. So the focus is in providing information and teaching in the mentoring relationship, whereas you're teaching in the coaching as well, but you're teaching it by doing the reverse. So hopefully that makes some sense, that you can see the difference in where the wisdom is residing. What I recommend you do when you're coaching is always start in coaching mode, and then be very conscious, be very self-aware of when you're moving into mentoring. And for those of you that are type A's, if you have any experience like I do, you will find yourself at first slipping into mentoring and being unaware of it. And then you'll become more and more aware of it, to where now I'm more or less able to go, ooh, shoot, I slipped into mentoring mode. I slipped back into my old ways of telling. I need to stop that and move back into coaching mode. Or I also will slip into mentoring mode very intentionally. So there's the intentional mentoring, and then there's the unintentional mentoring. And becoming self-aware so you can see the difference between the two will help you become more and more effective as a coach. Everyone I've talked with that's been around improvement for a while says that this transition from someone who does to someone who's coaching, if you're a type A, is one of the toughest things you'll ever do. But it will improve your life well outside of the job place. It'll improve relationships, parenting, being a kid, whatever you are, it helps that a lot, relationships especially. So now let's talk a little bit about coaching as Mike Rother talks about it in Toyota Kata. So the kata is a word that means a routine or pattern that's practiced over and over until it becomes second nature. So his kata is how you teach people to apply PDCA over and over and over so they become effective problem solvers. And it's very scientific, PDCA, as you know. So there are 5 questions that are always asked as you're learning how to coach, and then into the coaching mode pretty intensely in Toyota Kata. And the first thing is, what's your target condition? The next one is, well, where are we now? Third is, what obstacles are preventing you from getting to that target condition? Fourth is, what's your next step? And fifth is, when can we go and see what you've learned from taking that step? So this is moving us into the experimental mind, where a problem reveals itself, and then we view our countermeasures as possible solutions to a problem. So, and I say solutions there quite intentionally, possible. We have to go through the test. We have a hypothesis that we think this will work. Then we have to go and test it, and then we either prove it that yes it did, or no it didn't, or it would if it was tweaked. So this is teaching people from the front lines all the way up through middle and senior leaders how to think much more methodically. You'll notice that the kata method starts with the target condition, not current condition. And that's because it's important to be thinking about, where do we want to go? What do we want to be able to do behaviorally? How do we want to be able to perform as an organization, as a department, as a work unit? Where do we want to go? So this is a little different, because a lot of times people will start with the current condition. They know there's a problem, but they're not sure exactly how far they can get or where they want to go. And this is saying, no, 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 no. Start with target condition, then map your current condition, and then move forward. And if you'll notice on A3 formats, on the report formats, it's pretty much always in this order as well. So this is just a subtle difference in how we were taught problem solving decades ago. Okay, so now let's talk about Socratic questioning. So when I mentioned that in coaching mode you're asking questions, right? So what kinds of questions? Well, the best kinds of questions to ask are Socratic questions. So Socratic questions are named for Socrates, who was known for asking open-ended questions. And it was based on his belief that we have to get much more rigorous in our thinking, much more disciplined. That we have sometimes a tendency toward a bit of a lazy mind and lazy thinking, and I don't mean lazy in a derogatory way. I mean an unscientific definition of lazy. So when you ask yes or no questions, which are closed-ended questions, you risk the person kind of sneaking into that unscientific, undisciplined thinking and not having to be as rigorous. Open-ended questions cause the learner to think very, very deeply, and that's where the deepest learning occurs. So what are Socratic questions? Well, there are 6 categories of Socratic questions, and there are lots and lots of examples within each of these categories, but this will give you just an idea of the kinds of questions, and these are phenomenal when you're problem solving and working with a coachee. These are the questions that allow your coachee to develop, allow your coachee to identify where he or she needs additional development, allows you to assess as a teacher where do you have to move into mentoring mode, and it helps you also assess their growth. How are they progressing? If you're having to ask the same question over and over and over, something's not quite right and you need to make some adjustments. So one of the things I think is interesting with these questions is the what would happen if. This is one of those questions that if you're tempted to tell people what to do, you ask first these other questions to try to get them into coming up with that idea on their own. But if they can't, you can kind of straddle that line between coaching and mentoring. If you ask the question, what would happen if you, and then you recommend something, and then let them respond to that. So it's not as good as having them come up with the idea, but it's certainly better than telling them that they need to do blah, blah, blah. What would happen if, I think, is a very powerful question. The other question I use a lot, and I love it. You may think it's a little weird, but would it stand up in court? The good news is court dramas and movies have been around for decades, and most people have seen court on TV, whether it's dramatized or real. And they understand that there's a level of there's a bar that you have to meet in order for something that someone says in court to stand. So when they're used to that, bringing that into the workplace is an easier transition for some people. Now, if we said that, would it stand up in court? And I do it a little more joking than I do seriously, but it's actually a fairly effective question to ask people and get people thinking. I have found. You may find a different method works for you. So the wisdom in our evolving improvement professional role is knowing when to coach and when to mentor, and catching ourselves when we move into mentoring mode by mistake, because it's a habit. And it takes years to break habits of this depth that we were born and raised to tell people what to do, some of us. So it is a journey. All right, so some additional coaching traits that I have found make for the quickest development in people. They can all be developed in anybody, but this is for some of the quickest development. The first thing is remembering that you're serving that person. You're not serving yourself. So everything you do when you're in coaching mode has to be in service of that person, not in service of the results. But you're not doing it in exclusion of the results, but the primary responsibility is developing that person. That's key. Critical thinking. You have to be willing to take the time, and sometimes it's very hard to think through problems, but you need to be able to think through problems so that you're able to then meet with the person you're coaching with and help them think through the problems. Self-awareness, I've mentioned it, it's very helpful. I mean, if you don't do some sort of meditation or some other way to really get to know yourself, some people use therapy, you know, you really will benefit yourself by becoming incredibly self-aware. Psychological know-how, I think here the biggest one is knowing when to push someone and when to back off. You know, there's a point where when someone's developing and they're absorbing a lot of content, there are places where you can kind of push them to grow faster, and then there are times when they need to just absorb. And having that intuitive sense of knowing when to push and reading their body language and having clear communication and asking where they're at and how they're feeling will help you know when to keep pushing and when to back off. Patience, empathy, a balance between you did great and we need to get better results. There's, you can't just be all about doing better, doing better, doing better. You have to appreciate and recognize where someone has come and how they've been developing. There needs to be a balance between those. Technical expertise, I can't say this enough. We are moving away from the tools first mentality, but that doesn't mean the tools aren't important. They are necessary, but they're not all there is to the story. So you have to become expert in almost all of the tools that were on that list. And then finally, this clear communication, you've really got to understand how to do that. And you really need to have no self-interest in this. So some of you asked when you registered, what about people coaching and facilitating in their own areas? I don't find it very easy to do when you're coaching a big problem. Now, managers can coach their direct reports and should be coaching their direct reports, and that's important in day-to-day management. It's a very important skill to develop. But what I'm talking about in this particular case is if you have a big organizational problem that's quite vexing, it's helpful to have someone that's outside of that department leading that that effort. So whether you're facilitating a team or whether you're coaching one-on-one, it's helpful to have someone with some objectivity and no need to control the outcome in that role. Now, development. How do we work through development as an organization? Well, if you've got a large organization, just know it's going to take a long time. There's a lot of people to be trained and developed. It's going to take some time. I personally feel like it's better to start with a twofold prong, working with leadership first, and then if you have dedicated improvement professionals, them at the same time, and then move to managers. But I have had several conversations with some colleagues recently where they started with managers, and they're teaching managers how to do the kata method of the 5 questions and helping them learn how to teach the front lines, PDCA, and that they're finding that starting in the middle is actually having a tremendous amount of success. My experience has been that managers, no matter what the problem is, managers, if leadership isn't really understanding the process, they will sometimes get in the way of managers being successful. So I like to start with senior leadership and get them learning what PDCA is. And, you know, it's a bit tricky. Those of you who have worked with senior leadership, I'm sure will understand what I'm saying here. It's a bit tricky to help leaders understand and see that they need development in problem solving when the very reason why they're leaders is supposedly because they're great at solving problems. And how I typically couch it is something about how this kind of problem solving is a much more scientific model. It's not something that is taught in business schools, and unfortunately, and that's why it's a little different kind of problem solving from what they're already expert in. That's how I deal with it. But you have to know the people and know what will work with them. So during the Q&A, if you have specific questions about, you know, your organization and how many people and where you're at on your journey, I could much more specifically make some recommendations or offer some thoughts for developing your staff. All right, now the next thing is, no matter what you're doing to develop, one of the things that we're learning very quickly is while classroom can be helpful to understand concepts and just get a general awareness, the classroom's not where learning really occurs. It's in the lab, the living lab that's your workplace. So here's a great reminder of how when you're down here in the problem-solving area, 95% of the learning comes there through the doing. If you read about it, you're going to be able to get some basic concepts, but you're not going to be anywhere near proficient. And so practice, practice, practice is what gets us all the way down here to this 95%. So that is the end of the content part of the webinar. So let's just review where we're at, and then I have a bunch of questions that I have pulled out from your questions that I'd like to start with, and I see a number of questions coming in as well. So let's take this step by step. So how doing violates Toyota's core principle of respect for people. Hopefully you have a better sense of that now as far as the need to engage people and helping them learn how to remove obstacles with clear direction and guidance is a way to get that respect for people built back into the organization. I also feel, just a little side note, that having respect for people means that all processes are very well documented. They are managed on a regular basis. They are measured on a regular basis. Anytime there's an obstacle, it is visually revealed, hopefully, and if not, then verbally revealed, and there's some pretty quick action to resolve that problem. To allow problems to linger is being disrespectful to the workforce. The differences between facilitating and coaching, hopefully you've gotten a sense of that. The traits and skills that happen to be some of the more common skills for effective coaches. So I think, people that are control freaks and and want to tell everyone what to do are probably going to have a tougher time moving into this role, but it's not impossible. And then how to roll out a development program across your organization. We kind of shorted that a bit because it's just tough to be specific enough with such the variety that we've got on the phone. A quick thing before I go to questions. Many of you are familiar with all the different avenues for where you can get some more information and resources. Many of you may not be familiar with SlideShare and Vimeo. So Vimeo is a version like YouTube, only for longer videos. All of my recorded webinars are on my Vimeo channel. So everything for the past 2 or 3 years is on there. And then SlideShare is where the printed materials are. I also just set up a Google Plus account this week, but I haven't posted yet, and so I'm not going to advertise it until I post. And then again, if you don't get the newsletter, if you would sign up for that, then you'll know when the template is available for the skills matrix that you saw earlier in the webinar, and I'll send that out with the next newsletter. Okay, so I'm going to go to the questions coming in first from today, and then I'll move to some of the questions. I'm going to actually, yeah, we'll do this. Where does knowledge management fit in? Under learning theory? That's a good question. At the risk of offending anyone who's really into knowledge management, I think knowledge management was a buzzword that got a lot of legs in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, that has kind of fallen from favor in business circles as far as it being an actual executable entity. Knowledge management comes from having great communication and communicating results across an organization and sharing learning and all of those things, and documented processes, and all those things play into knowledge management. Also succession planning and making sure that when people leave an organization, someone has absolutely picked up their job and knows everything they do before they leave, so that when the new person comes in, if there's a gap, there's someone who's there to teach them, and all those things play into knowledge management. So Aston, maybe if you have anything that you want to ask specifically about knowledge management, something that's kind of concerning to you, it would be helpful to know a little more detail about what your question's around. Let's see, Mike, template for lean assessment for service industry. So I'm not sure, Mike, if you're referring to the Excel tool that I showed you, or you mean lean assessment for an organization, how ready it is for lean? I'm not quite sure what you're talking about. I have several templates that I use when I'm working with clients that are assessment tools on how ready they are for lean. And actually these days I won't work with clients if they don't meet a minimum threshold of how ready they are for lean. And that if they're not ready, I can give them some remedial work to get ready. So Mike, if you could give me more information on that, that would be great. Okay, so Ashok has a question. Sorry for a long question. When you say coaching has wisdom coming from the coachee, you are digging information what he or she knows rather than telling them what you know. That's correct. When does a coach tell a coachee what he has to share? Oh, okay. So you go into mentoring mode where you're telling them when you've identified a gap. So if you're working with someone and you ask a question, like let's just say that I see a need for a job aid to be created to solve a problem. There's an error that keeps being made over and over and over, and they need to create a job aid. So I'll ask a series of questions about, what their thoughts are on what the root cause is of the problem, the quality problem. What are some of the possible countermeasures to put in place? And let's say they don't mention a job aid. And then I might ask another couple questions about documented processes to see, what they already understand about documented processes. And then I might slip into a yes or no binary question, say, do you know about job aids? Because some people, especially outside of manufacturing, haven't even heard the term before. And if the person says no, then I will clearly move into mentoring mode, say, okay, here's what a job aid is. And then I'll show them some examples and that type of thing. But I'll start always, or I try to start always, in the coaching mode so that I'm allowing them to show their knowledge and use their knowledge. And only when I see that they don't have the knowledge do I move into mentoring mode. So I hope that helps. And please let me know if you have a follow-up question. Okay, next question, same person, Ashok. I have used A3 or DMAIC steps to show as an example which gets results and request them to participate in review sessions to see for themselves and provide feedback if it is in line with their methodology to get buy-in from leadership. So Ashok, please let me know if I don't see a question. Let me see. I've used A3. Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is. So if you could please drop me another. Oh, it's a comment. Okay, thank you. All right, thank you very much. Okay, Jenny. As a coach in problem-solving Kaizen, how important is it to understand the people's business industry versus understand the problem-solving process? Oh, good question. So a couple things. A process is a process is a process. So being expert in process design and process analysis is the very most important thing. But it's imperative that you know something about it. So when I go into a brand new industry, which there are very few left, but when I would go into a brand new industry, the first thing I would do is see if I had any family or friends in that industry, and I'd call them and say, tell me about your industry. And I would Google, I would do some research. And then when I got in front of the client, I'd say some basic questions. Who are your competitors? Where are you in the marketplace? Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 20. What's going on in your market? Is it flat? Is it shrinking? Is it growing? If it's growing, where is it growing? What are your problems? I ask leadership, what keeps you up at night? I ask, are there any regulatory challenges on the horizon? I ask, where you spend your money. When you look at your expenses, what percent are in these basic buckets? I ask, and then if I'm working on a specific problem, like I'm actually starting with a new client in a few weeks, we're going to value stream map something that is a little new to me. Well, we're going to put a value stream map, a very sketchy one together, a very drafty one, on the phone. I'm going to have them walk through the process so that I know a little bit about it before I walk in. And then the first day on site, I'm going to physically walk the value stream, and then I'll lead value stream mapping. So I think it's actually an advantage to not be too close to the process, because you can do what I call going native, meaning that you get too close to the process and you don't keep the objectivity that generates great questions. So the main thing for a facilitator is to be asking questions that allow a team to see opportunities and different ways that they could be solving a problem. So Jenny, let me know if there's anything more you'd like on that one. Okay, Brett, getting enrollment from senior leadership. How can we create value for them to support a process they see as fluffy? Okay, Brett, you have to tell me which process they see as fluffy here. I have to know which process it is in order to answer that question. What is fluffy in their mind? Not in your mind, not in my mind. In their mind, what is fluffy? Okay, I'll let you do that. I'm going to go ahead and move on for, oh, there we go. 5S systems implementation. Okay, I'm not sure what you mean by that. So you want to bring in 5S across the organization, I think, is what you're saying, and they see it as probably just house cleaning. So I guess I would take the direction that we're moving into now, whereas we're looking at problems and then selecting tools. So if you define the problem first and get leadership to agree on the problem, if 5S is still the right countermeasure for that problem and the most important countermeasure for that problem, then they are much more likely to buy in. But if you just start, this is, again, we're moving away from that, I've got a tool, let's apply it. Leadership's wise to be a bit cynical and critical about that, because we really have to make sure that we're spending our effort on things that matter, and what matters are solving problems. So I would perhaps, and this is different from how I used to operate 5 years ago. I mean, it's very different from how most of us operated 5 years ago. So I would definitely go back and take a look at what the organizational problems are, make sure 5S is the right countermeasure, and get agreement on the problem up front, get agreement on why 5S is the right countermeasure, teach them, you got to get in front of them and teach them and all of those things. So I'm going to skip down to what you said in response. I'm also disconnected with the idea that you said it's almost always a system problem and not a people problem. I understand from my lean training that behind every system problem there is a management problem. Okay, so management's not people. People manage, but management is a system issue. So what I mean by problems aren't usually people, I mean that when people kind of blame Sally for being lazy or not caring about her work or not being easy to work with in a team, there are usually systems problems on why Sally's behaving that way. If Joe is being highly resistant and difficult, there's usually a reason why Joe is being difficult. And, personalities do play in. Don't get me wrong. Personalities absolutely play in. But when you have people that are not performing like they should and need to be, it's usually because they don't have the right tools, they don't have the right resources. I'll give you an example. I had a client that had a quality problem, and they were really beating up on their people pretty badly. And what we found out when we did true problem solving and got into the true root cause was that the system wasn't doing what it needed to do in order for these people to be successful. And until we went through that methodical approach to problem solving, leadership didn't get that it was actually the system that was, and I mean here the IT system, not the system as in the holistic system of an organization. The IT system wasn't delivering. So I guess you just have to look at, again, what's the problem, what's the root cause, and then you'll find that in most cases people are not the problem. And as far as leadership, just a quick note about leadership. So leadership is often a problem in terms of their acceptance of, understanding of, and commitment to continuous improvement. But again, that's usually something that if you have the CEO on board, the CEO is typically able to get the rest of the senior leadership team on board. I personally have found very little success with organizations getting very far on a continuous improvement journey if they don't have senior leadership committed. And I'm sorry to say that for those of you who work with organizations where that's your reality, but you probably understand where I'm coming from on this because you're probably living it day in and day out. It's very difficult if you don't have senior leadership on board. You can make very small pockets and you can improve people's jobs in the weeds, and on a very tactical level, it's very tough to make wide organizational change that really matters on an organizational level. Okay, next question. Greg, our organization is very early on the lean path. That is, many tools are new to us. As a continuous improvement coordinator, would it make sense for me to do and show first before progressing into coach or mentor? You say it violates Toyota's core principle, but would it make sense in this case? I'm never a fan of doing, I have got to say. I think that, let's just talk about resistance for a moment. When you do for people, you are much more likely to get resistance to anything you try, and it's just going to make your job so darn hard. And the other thing is that you're not teaching people to fish. So again, start with what are the problems, and then choose the right approach for problem solving. It might be a very big problem and complicated and involve a lot of functions, and maybe A3 would be a good way to go. Or it might be a micro problem where you can just do some one-on-one coaching with the front lines and do some quick hits and get them exposed to daily Kaizen. But no, I don't think it serves anyone well for anyone to do unless it is a rare and urgent situation. And this is not rare or urgent, just starting the path. I'm talking about someone who has a pretty effective continuous improvement culture in place, and then suddenly they are at risk of losing a major client, a customer, and they've got to do blah, 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 and you've got to do it quickly. That may be where you jump in and you do, because it has to be done. There's no time for teaching people. But that, again, needs to be very, very rare. So I would not do. Okay, is 5S a countermeasure or a foundation required to implement lean so that one can be successful in business? Very good question, Ashok. So, to me, 5S can be a countermeasure when you've got a non-standardized, non-organized, non-clean, non-sustainable environment, and that is a problem that it's creating problems. So it can be a countermeasure there. 5S as a foundation, yes. However, what most people do in establishing a foundation is they go in and they 5S everything. And they 5S more visually than they do in terms of putting standard work in place. And the fourth S of the 5S's is a meaty, big step. And that's getting all the processes analyzed and documented and improved. I mean, if you're doing organizations out there do only 5S, but they're doing it the right way, where they're standardizing the work, they're error-proofing it, they're creating flow, all within the context of 5S. And that's the beauty of what 5S really is, but that's not how it's applied most of the time in the U.S. So, yes, if you're doing it that way, and you're incorporating all of your improvement under the 5S umbrella, then sure, I think it makes a lot of sense. Okay, let me see if I missed anything. Okay, so back to Mike for a second. Lean assessment for the organization, something like what it is on the AME website. You know what? I haven't seen what's on the AME website. I will take a look at that, and I will get back with you, Mike. AME website, lean assessment. I haven't seen anything publicly available. I have my own, but let me take a look at that. We can talk offline. Thank you. Okay, next thing. All right, let me jump to some questions. Now I'm going to jump to another PowerPoint slideshow here. Hang on a second. Let me, from current slide. Okay, hang on. All right, so here are some questions that people asked when they registered that I thought were really good questions and warranted some good, thoughtful answers here. So question one was drawing out team suggestions without suggesting ideas yourself. We've talked a little bit about this, but I want to get a little more specific. So if you take it in stages, it will allow you to evaluate where they're at, and it will keep you and basically be behavior modification for you to learn how to do this on a daily basis. So first thing is to walk them through PDCA, teach them PDCA, and give them the opportunity to discover the right countermeasure that you have in your head as they're going through PDCA. Then You can introduce any new concepts that they're not coming up with and invite them to determine the pros and cons. So at this point, you haven't suggested it yet, but you have thrown it out there to assess whether they know what it is, and then to have them start debating pros and cons. Because a lot of times, if you have a couple of people you're working with, one person might immediately poo-poo something and say, nah, that won't work. And then the other person might say, well, wait a minute, let's talk about it. Maybe it would. And then you can get them discussing it and debating it, and then they'll all agree, and it hasn't been your idea at all. It's their idea at that point, which is ideal because that's what helps us sustain improvement. And then the last resort would be introducing a concept, but listening very carefully to any concerns they have. And I would not ever, ever, ever introduce something. Well, I have one exception. I'll tell you in a minute. But I wouldn't ever implement something that the bulk of the workforce was saying no to. Now, here's my one exception to that is open workplaces. I have never heard of an organization move to an open workplace and had even a small percentage of people saying, woohoo, let's do it. Most people are highly resistant. They're afraid to lose their space. They're afraid to lose their walls. They're afraid to lose the quiet. They're afraid to use their privacy. They're afraid to lose a lot of things, and that fear, raises up with resistance. So if the organization is deciding that moving to an open workplace is solving a problem, and it's not being done because it's a trend, but there's a specific problem that will solve, it may be that you have to just go ahead and implement it without consensus. However, it's critical that people have a lot of communication. They understand why very deeply. They're given an opportunity to raise concerns, and that some of those concerns are being listened to. For example, if the person feels like they're going to lose all privacy, what if they have to call their doctor or talk to their kid's teacher? There should be a private place for a private phone call. And if there's not, then that's not going to be an effective workplace for anybody. If they're concerned about noise, you have to address the noise factor. So I'm just giving that as an example, but if you're moving to something where you're telling people that this is the way it's going to be, they've got to understand why, and they have to have a lot of opportunity to raise concerns and have them all addressed. Ramrodding something down a workforce's throat is never going to be effective. And everybody I know who's gone to an open workplace has eventually loved it, so if it was done right. Okay, let's see. So another thing to think about, though, is that when you do this, you're going to have to take it a lot slower than you're probably accustomed to and would like to. It takes a lot of patience, as I said, to do this kind of coaching. And the other thing is, I think that it's important to set our minds in the right framework before we even get into working with a person or a team on improvement. You're very likely going to experience whatever you're expecting to experience. In other words, when you think that you're going to have resistance, you will have resistance far more frequently, and it'll be far greater than if you think you are not and you're prepared to deal with the resistance in a very open, open book, a very transparent way. Your mindset when you walk into improvement, I mean, I've tested this for years and years and years, 20 years or so. My mind, when I get in front of a team, almost directly mirrors what I get. So it's important to expect that you're not going to get resistance and be prepared for the little bit that you may get. All right, that was a good question. All right, next one, how to manage conflict better. So quite a number of you asked this question. Here are some recommendations I have, and this is all on every person's different, so this is going to be a little hard for everyone to do everything. But first of all, it sounds easy, right? Become personally comfortable with it. Just become comfortable with conflict. But you do. You have to become comfortable with conflict, and you have to become comfortable with it, understanding that it's not about you. It's about them and their mindset and their experiences. People have resistance and argue with people for good reason. So become comfortable in the midst of argument. Next, be fully present. It is so tempting to kind of check out and start thinking about the next thing you want to say and all those things. You have to be fully present and listen really carefully to what everyone is saying. You can't have an agenda. When you're in the middle of a conflict, you have to be objective about what's going on. Another thing that I do is I give the people that I'm working with absolute permission. In fact, I kind of beg them to disagree. And once you give people permission to disagree, it's a whole different ball game from them thinking that they can't, and then when they do, it erupts. And so you want to set some ground rules on what disagreement should be, and it's that you're being very professional and mature and saying very candidly, I disagree, and this is the reason why, without emotion. So if you allow people to do that, it's much more likely it's not going to escalate into something that's much more uncomfortable. And the other thing is really watch body language, because your truth radar, which we all have, we were all born with it. Kids are so good at knowing when people are telling the truth and when they aren't, and then we lose it as we get older. So you can get it back again by a lot of self-awareness, quiet time, reflection, etc. But watch body language and invite it. So if you see that someone's resisting or there's conflict that's developing with two people, I actually draw it out. So I'll say, Joe, it sounds like you're not agreeing with Betty on this. Did I read that correctly? And then Joe usually says yes. I go, well, what's behind that? What's your concern? And I want them to get their disagreement out in the open instead of hiding it, where I can deal with it and it doesn't fester. Next, keep directing them back to whatever the objective is. So, for example, if you're solving a problem and it's been clearly defined on what the problem is, and you know that that is the problem, keep coming back to the problem. But the problem is da-da-da-da. But the problem is da-da-da-da. Because they've already agreed to that. If you're through that process of getting consensus on the problem, they've already agreed there. Getting people to come back to a consensus state helps them then work together toward a collaborative solution. And then the other thing is that if you ask questions, they may not even understand the reason why they're in conflict. So if you have two departments that are kind of against each other, and there's an idea and one department saying yes and the other department saying no, you have to just probe into why is it? Why is that department saying no? And hopefully you'll be able to uncover, and you're usually able to uncover the true root cause, and then you've got something to really work with. The other thing is that sometimes people are in conflict because they are lacking information. And so you have to ask questions about what they know to make sure that there's not some gap that you need to fill. And maybe you can't even fill it. Maybe there's a gap and you're like, well, let's call Joe. Let's bring Joe in and see what, if maybe Joe can provide some insights here and get all the information on the table. And then the last thing I'll mention is the scientific method for problem solving. While it is not at all a system where you're going to have no conflict whatsoever, you have a lot less of it. Because it's so methodical, and you're following a prescribed PDCA process or DMAIC, whatever you use. It's very prescribed and it's helpful to reduce conflict. Okay, next question. How to coach virtually? This was a really good question. So I think this came from one of our global friends. One of the things is you've got to have some sort of visual. So you've got to use WebEx, GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar, something like that, and be able to use a screen sharing system. And for those of you who aren't all that familiar with these systems, right now, for example, I could give anyone on this call control of my mouse. So with a click, I could give you control of my mouse and you could do whatever you want to on my computer. So when you're collaborating and doing coaching, it's often helpful to give someone control of the mouse if you're drawing something, or you're, let's say that someone is having trouble figuring out the visual layout of something that they want to do. You can actually give them control of the mouse and have them draw in what they're seeing that you can't possibly see. The other thing is that it's really important to establish rules. This is true in in-person coaching as well. What are the rules going to be? How often is the coach going to touch base with the coachee? How often does the coachee feel they want it, and how often does the coach feel that they need it? And then, hopefully they match, but if they don't, you negotiate. And then another rule is that both parties have to share freely. So, for example, when I coach virtually quite a bit. I coach improvement professionals and I coach leaders quite a bit. And one of the rules of thumbs is that I need to be told how I'm coaching. I need that feedback. So, occasionally I'll ask, but if in lieu of me asking, the other person has to be able to say, I would benefit more if you coached this way or that way. And then the other thing is that, there's a fair amount of me catching myself in mentoring mode when I should be in coaching mode. And then that always generates a little bit of a laugh. And you can self-correct and all that. But you need agreement on sharing freely. Another thing I've learned is that when you're coaching remotely or virtually, get a photo of the person. It helps so much to know, if you don't have cameras, it helps so much to know what someone looks like. And so make sure you know what the person looks like that you're coaching. Now, another thing, I'll give you some suggestions. I do a fair amount of A3 coaching, and what I do for those is that we have weekly scheduled calls. They're usually scheduled for an hour, but in the beginning stages, sometimes 2 hours. And then I always give them the ability to call me as needed if something comes up, but they're always scheduled for sure. At a minimum, we're going to have a weekly scheduled call. What happens then is the problem owner, if you're familiar with A3, sends their A3 report at least 4 business hours prior to the call, and I review it. And if you're serving in a coaching role, that prep is essential, because once that call starts, you can't be trying to figure out where they're at. You have to have your questions prepared and have a sense of where they're going, and have a sense of what types of help you think they may need, and all of that, to make sure that the call is an effective call. And then the other thing is, on one-on-one coaching with leaders or improvement professionals, I personally always deal with a defined agenda. What are we going to work on next? And then I give homework if it's needed. Of course, I don't just give it. It's a collaborative thing, and I say, what would you think about da-da-da-da-da? And the person agrees, and then we have an agreed upon submission, or we wait for the next call or whatever. But again, those calls you need to do really thorough prep to be effective as a coach. So I can't remember who asked that, but if you're on the line, let me know if there's anything else about coaching virtually, or anyone, if you have any questions about coaching virtually that I can help you with. Okay, 12:26 my time, so we've got 4 more minutes. Let's keep going on a few more questions. How to be more confident? I think I answered this, but I do think that you just have to start coaching, but you also shouldn't start coaching if you don't have a fair amount of proficiency with some of the technical and business tools you're going to need to be an effective coach. So if you're a coach and you feel like you really don't have a high degree of proficiency in a fair number of the tools, you're going to be coaching with an empty tool belt. And so it's going to make you lack confidence, because you're not going to have, all the different tools you need to pull out at any given time. And there's no way in the improvement world to know what kind of tool you're going to need. So the more you can develop your proficiency with tools, the more confident you'll be. And practice, practice, practice. Get out there and coach and get feedback. Don't be afraid to ask for feedback. How am I as a coach? What do you like about my coaching style? What do you not like about my coaching style? What drives you crazy about my coaching style? Be honest, get honesty back. Next thing is involving upper management. Someone asked a question about how to get upper management involved in improvement, which is kind of out of scope or off topic, but I'm going to give you just a couple things since a few of you asked it. First thing is that if you don't have an improvement plan in place, like a strategic deployment plan or Hoshin Connery, a strategy deployment plan or a policy deployment plan, it's sometimes referred to, you're likely not going to be aligned as much as you should be organizationally, and you may be using resources ineffectively. So the strategic deployment plans are done by senior management and upper management. They're the ones that are helping decide what are the business goals for the year, what problems do we face, which ones do we need to tackle first, second, third. I mean, it's a very formalized, methodical way of figuring out where you're going to make improvement. And then, of course, there's always that rare, something comes out of left field that you didn't plan for, and you have to accommodate that. But if you start with a plan, then those things don't come out of left field every day, so you'll be much better served. The other thing is in value stream mapping, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse on this, but I still see so many people putting together value stream mapping teams that are too low in the organization. The future state value stream map, if it's a real value stream map, is typically a fairly significant change to how you do business. The leadership has to buy into that. So if you don't have them on the team in order to authorize that future state, then you're going to have to go through a whole sales process, and because they weren't there for the current state development and to hear all the reasons why you have problems, then they're not going to be as able to say yay or nay to the future state. So they need to be engaged with value stream mapping. Next thing is executive sponsorship of improvement processes and problems and projects. If you have an executive sponsor, they should be actively engaged, and so that gets them involved. And then also briefings. Any of the group team activities that you should have regular briefings, and leaders should be coming to those briefings to keep them in the loop and engaged with the process. Those are just some ideas. You could do one-on-one coaching, one-on-one feedback sessions as well. Okay, that is it for that. Now there's a couple more questions that came in. Oh, it's 12:30. I'm going to go one more minute here. Okay, when facilitating, how do you keep yourself motivated when others around you are not participating in problem solving or don't seem interested? All right, so I guess my first question for this is answering a question with a question, this is Socratic, is how did the people in this room, in this situation, get on the team, or how were they selected? So if they were selected to be on a team, I'm curious why they're not participating. And let me back up. People can't be just selected and thrown on a team and being told you're going to be on this team. Charters, if you use a charter, there's a process for a charter, and if you don't use a charter, you have to have one. There's clearly identifying the problem, clearly identifying the scope, then figuring out who needs to be on the team once you have your scope decided, making sure it's cross-functional in representation. And then let's say that you have your short list of people you want on a team, and I'm assuming this is a team because you say others. When you approach them, then it's not just a matter of them necessarily having to say yes. They need to be given an opportunity to say yes or no, and if no, why, and all those things. So, I'm not sure. Is it Jignesh? If you could maybe give me another specific scenario on who these people are that you're saying. And as far as keeping yourself motivated, I personally find change highly motivating. Some people find it highly scary. I find it very motivating. And so, I like to see people when their light bulbs go off in their heads and when they get excited because they've had impact on their job and they've been able to control something in their job. So that keeps me motivated. But maybe, Janesh, you can mention one more thing. I think that is it. So if there are any more questions, I'm going to put down, there was a hand up. Karen, did you want to ask a verbal question? If you could put your hand back up, click your hand again if you wanted to ask a verbal question. And if anyone else is writing a question, if you can put your hand up, and I'll wait for one more minute to see if anything else comes in before I sign off. Okay, so Karen, I think you want to be unmuted. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Karen, are you there? Karen, if you're using your phone, if you haven't put the audio pin that's on the control panel, you need to put pound and then the number and then pound again, or I won't be able to hear you. So I'll give you a moment to do that. Are you there, Karen? Okay, I think we must have either the phone system is not working or maybe you pressed your hand by mistake. Okay, thank you everyone. I really appreciate you participating in this. We had a lot more questions I would love to have gotten to that you asked when you registered that were really good ones. Please feel free to drop me an email if there's anything you'd like me to elaborate on. And like I said, I'll put together the final version of that skills matrix and announce it in my newsletter. And then the last thing is I'm starting to think about webinars for the fall and into the spring of 2012. It's 2012 already. Oh, I can't believe it. So please let me know if there's anything that you would like, any topics that you'd like. As you're signing off, there's a question on the survey for that. So thanks very much. I'd love to get your direct feedback if you'd like to give it to me. Have a great day and happy improving. Bye, everyone.